Hi, everybody. So this week we're going to be covering the sociology of race and ethnicity. Now, as you can imagine, this can be a very contentious topic for people to address. Unfortunately, we live in a society that has made discussions about race and racism a bipartisan political issue instead of addressing it as a humanitarian issue or as a social problem, which it inevitably is. So I feel the need to preface the lecture videos this week with a reminder, a disclaimer, that my job as a sociology professor, as a scientist, as a doctor of sociology, is to provide you with facts, to provide you with empirical evidence. And using that empirical evidence, it's up to you to formulate your own opinions and perspectives. It is not my job to try and convince you to be aligned with one political ideology or another. It's not my job to tell you what your values and beliefs should be. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm going to present to you the science on race, the science about how we know the history of race and how it was constructed in societies, and then studies that use empirical evidence and have undergone the rigorous process of peer review to demonstrate their validity and reliability and objectivity, to demonstrate to you that racism is still a social problem in our society today. Again, not my objective to force any political, religious, or ideological beliefs upon you. That's up to you. It's my job to present to you the science, the facts. That's what my training is in as a doctor of sociology, and that's what I'm doing here. The reason I feel the need to include that preface at the beginning of this particular discussion is because this has become one of the most contentious and unfortunately divisive tools of rhetoric and politics that's dividing our nation today. And I think that's extremely unfortunate that we've taken a human rights issue and turned it into a politics issue. To say that if you support racism, you're one political party. If you don't support racism, you're another. I mean, that seems like such a ridiculous argument to be having in 2020. But again, not my objective to force any beliefs upon you. I'm here to present to you the science of race and what we know about racial inequalities that exist in society today. So everything I'm presenting to you is coming from a scientific basis. Okay, that's it. I'm restating that one more time. I'm sharing with you science, okay? Not popular opinion, not media representation. This is scientifically grounded discussion on the sociology of race and ethnicity. So with that in mind, let's begin. First, I think it'd be helpful to outline a couple of objectives, learning objectives. What are the takeaways that I hope you leave this series of video lectures and more broadly this week's content with? Well, first, I'd like you to understand how race is and has been socially constructed throughout history. One of the biggest myths, one of the biggest lies that our society was built on is that there is some sort of biological or inherent difference or value amongst races. And that is a complete scientific myth. It is totally debunked by science. Race is completely socially constructed, and I'll support the evidence to defend that claim momentarily. The next objective is to be able to define concepts of prejudice, discrimination, racism, and bias. All of these are very much sociologically informed terms, and we'll discuss how each of these terms operates in society today and what the consequences are of them. The next objective is to examine scientific data on racism in US society. Like I said, I'm only presenting to you science. I'm presenting to you findings from peer-reviewed, published scientific studies that have been assessed by a panel of experts for their validity, reliability, and objectivity. I'm not presenting to you headlines from the media unless those headlines from the media were based on a scientific study. And the science tells us that yes, racism is still a problem in our society today. Racism did not get erased when slavery was abolished. Racism did not get erased when the Civil Rights Act was passed. Racism is still very much a social problem that affects the lived experiences of not only people of color, but also arguably of white people in our society today. I also want everyone, after this week's content, to be able to reflect on our own implicit biases. As we'll talk about later, every single person living in the United States, including people of color, have racial biases because we are products of the societies that we live in. The good news about this is that our biases can be corrected if we take ownership of them and actually work towards addressing them. So we'll talk more about that. And then lastly, I want us all to be able to understand the concept of white privilege. And this is a very sensitive subject, especially for us white folks, myself included, because as we'll talk about later, we've been socialized as white people to be in a position of privilege and power based off the color of our skin that enables us to take for granted the many, many ways our whiteness affords us unearned advantages and benefits in society. And even more than that, it just allows us to live our life without being bothered because of the color of our skin, which is not something that people of color have access to. So again, this is a really uncomfortable subject matter. Like I've said from the beginning of our class, at the beginning of the semester, and continuously since then, to get sociology, to be able to click on that sociological imagination, it requires us to lean into discomfort, to have uncomfortable conversations, to reflect on our own experiences, on our own ideas and beliefs and behaviors, and to question what we're doing, and more importantly, why we are doing the things that we are doing. And that definitely speaks true for the subject of race and ethnicity, which we're going to be covering today. So the first thing that we should address is providing some definitions for these terms. What are race and ethnicity? Well, they're two different things. So a race refers to a group of people who share distinct physical characteristics that a society thinks are important and quote unquote biological. And I put biological, those scare quotes around biological, because as we'll talk about later, there really is no biological justification that people are different races. There is one race, that is the human race. The biological differences, such as differences in skin color or hair texture or facial framing, those are so tiny in terms of the genetic differences between people, so tiny. We're talking less than 1% of genetic differences across between white people versus Black people versus Native Americans versus Asians, etc. There's virtually no biological difference, but we as a society have decided that these physical traits, things like skin color, hair texture, facial framing, etc., are significant enough that we can categorize people based off of them. So that's what race is referred to. A group of people that share physical characteristics that society has determined are important enough because they are quote unquote biological differences. All right, an ethnic group refers to a group of people that share a cultural or national heritage. All right, so by these definitions, we see that race and ethnicity are not the same thing. Unlike race, which is based on observable physical traits, things like skin color, hair texture, etc., ethnicities are not necessarily observable, right? One good example of this is that two people of the same race may have different ethnicities, and on the flip side, two people of the same ethnicity may be of different races, all right? So a couple examples of this. You could have a white Irish person versus a white South African person, right? So in this instance, both individuals would be of the same race, being white, but they would be of different ethnicities, one of them being Irish, one of them being South African. Another example could be having a Black British person versus an Asian British person. So in this context, these two individuals would have different races. One would be Black, one would be Asian, but they would be of the same ethnicity because they are of the same country of origin, in this case being from Britain. Right? Another good example of this, if you're familiar with the celebrities on the left here, we have Cameron Diaz on the top and Rosario Dawson on the bottom. Both of these actresses are actually Hispanic Cuban Americans, so they share the same ethnicity. However, Cameron Diaz is white and Rosario Dawson identifies as Black. Right? So race and ethnicity, terms that are often used interchangeably in our society, but they do have distinct meanings, and from a sociological perspective, it's important that we recognize what those differences are. So let's talk in a little more detail about the social construction of race. So in order to understand how we as a society constructed race, meaning race didn't exist until we gave it meaning, we need to take a closer look at the history of race. not just in the US, but from a global perspective. And I think it's important to revisit C. Wright Mills and the concept of the sociological imagination, right? So we've been talking about the sociological imagination the entire semester. The very first week of the semester, I asked you to read a chapter from Mills' book titled The Sociological Imagination. And here's an excerpt from that, if you remember back to reading that particular reading of Mills. In it, Mills says that the sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two within society. No social study that does not come back to the problems of biography, of history, and of their intersections within a society has completed its intellectual journey. So what exactly does this mean? Basically, it means that we need to understand or reflect on the historical origins of any social phenomenon or any social topic that we discuss if we want to have a fully sociological understanding of what that term means and what the implications are in society today. So to understand how the social structure of race affects individuals in society today, we must first consider how race has been shaped and used throughout history. Our current understandings and tensions surrounding race didn't come from thin air, they are historically grounded. So without having an accurate understanding of the history of race, why this concept of race was socially constructed in the first place and how it exists today, we cannot really grasp from a sociological perspective the broader implications of race and racial disparities and inequalities that are affecting our society today. So we need a bit of a history lesson, is the moral of this story. So race is socially constructed. So when we say something is socially constructed, again, we mean that means that society created it. Society gave it meaning, whether it's a particular phenomenon or concept or construct. In this case, the construct of race was something that we as a society created. Skin color is not inherently or biologically meaningful. Genetically speaking, humans of all quote-unquote races, being black, white, Asian, Native American, whatever, all human beings share about 99.9% of the same DNA. There is so much more similarity amongst human beings than there is differences. Yet, we give meaning to race because it was created as a social construct. We decided that we wanted to group people based off of certain characteristics, physical characteristics, in the case of race, skin color. We just as easily could have constructed a classification system of humans based off of eye color, based off of hair color, based off the presence of freckles, based off of height. We could have chosen any physical characteristic to classify people. But people, specifically white people, and we'll talk about this in a bit, decided that they were going to use skin color as a means to create this classification system of human beings on the basis that skin color was representative of cultural and intellectual superiority or inferiority, depending on what the color of your skin was. All right. This was created by people. Race is a new invention. It's relatively new convention. It's only a few hundred years old. Before the 14 and 1500s, there was no such thing as races. There was no such thing as being white or black, etc. There was just people from different cultures, people from different civilizations, from different nations, etc. But race did not exist until we, as people, gave it meaning. All right? So the physical distinctions we use to categorize people and the meaning of those differences are created by society, and they change across time and location. Again, another way to support evidence that something is socially constructed is to look at it in a historical context or to look at it in a cross-cultural context. If we just look at the history of racial definitions and racial categories in the United States, for example, how the US Census definitions of race have changed throughout history, we can see very clearly that race is something that is socially constructed. In the year 1790, when the first census came out, there were only two racial categories identified on the US Census, and that was white or other. So if you weren't identified as white, your race was other. You weren't black, you weren't Native American, you weren't Asian, you weren't Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, you were just other, right? And then you can see that throughout time, these categories continue to shift to include different and more specific categories up until the 2010 census, which was the last one we had. We have the 2020 census in place now, but the categories for race you can see are right here. So race and the meaning that we assign it has shifted across time.